It's time to rank each and every race of the 2022 season in a tier list. It will be an interesting ranking with the season being wrapped up long before the end, and there's a lot to talk about. So let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Bahrain first, and this was an awesome opener to set the scene for the 2022 season. The new aerodynamic era meant it was Red Bull and Ferrari at the top of the pecking order, with Leclerc and Verstappen battling it out in the desert. It was great to watch, and their wheel-to-wheel racing was thrilling. It was a great way to show that this year was going to be different, with Mercedes clearly being off the pace relative to where they'd been for the last 8 seasons. But the drama didn't finish with a battle between Leclerc and Verstappen, as both Red Bulls retired in the closing stages of the race, with both drivers having fuel system problems as the teething issues became known. At this stage in the season, it looked like the points that could be lost from this race might have even been critical considering how close the Ferrari and Red Bull packages looked through the race. And so for me, I think this race deserves to be in the top tier category. It was the beginning of a new era for the sport, and it looked very competitive indeed. Saudi Arabia. Formula 1 stayed in the Middle East for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix next, and this weekend was one that was marred by the missile attack on the Aramco facility just a short distance from the circuit in Jeddah. The race itself was an interesting one as the battle between Red Bull and Ferrari continued, with Sergio Perez taking the pole position. In the first stint, Perez was managing the pace well, but an unfortunately timed safety car for the Mexican driver after Latifi crashed into the barrier meant the other front runners were able to leapfrog the Red Bull driver to take the lead away from him. It was then a brilliant battle to fight for the lead as Verstappen and Leclerc competed once again, even to the extent that they tried to be behind the DRS detection line to gain an advantage down the long start-finish straight. Elsewhere in Jeddah, there were on-track battles, with the Alpine teammates competing closely and a close middle order starting to appear, with Mercedes firmly in that mix with the midfield runners. It was a good follow-up to Bahrain, and actually I think it deserves to join that race in the top tier. Australia next, and this race was exciting, but only because it was the return of Formula 1 to the country after a few years away. The race itself wasn't all that great, and it was a Grand Slam victory for Charles Leclerc on this occasion, winning the race by more than 20 seconds after Verstappen retired with his second mechanical issue in 3 races. There were a few highlights, including a daring strategy from Alex Albon in his Williams, where he completed all but one lap on the same set of tyres to secure a single point for that team. There were some good battles in the midfield as well, with McLaren coming out on top in that group, but on the whole, I think this race was just a bit boring on this occasion, and hopefully it'll be more competitive next season. Emilia-Romagna. Imola was next, and this was the only race of the season where a driver from outside of the top 3 teams managed to secure a podium finish. Shock podiums and even race wins have become more frequent in the last couple of years. With the new regulations though, the gap between the top 3 teams and the rest of the order has widened, which is to be expected given the difference in talent and resources. But the changeable conditions at Imola allowed for more competitive racing, and it was Lando Norris that got his opportunity in a car that was quite frankly dreadful in the season opener in Bahrain. The weekend saw the first sprint of the year, and arguably this took away from the race itself. The wet qualifying on Friday meant there was a mixed up grid, and the sprint seemed to sort out the order with the faster cars moving towards the front and the slower ones moving back. That was therefore a shame on the whole, but at least there was some excitement in the sprint itself. On the whole, I think this race goes in the might watch the highlights tier. Miami. It was then time for the inaugural race in Miami, where F1 delivered a star-studded event on a new circuit. This race was one where the organisers tried to do things differently, and it was certainly a spectacle. The circuit itself didn't produce exceptional racing, and the race only got interesting after a late safety car bunched up the order and made the final 10 laps good to watch. Some drivers had held out to take advantage of a VSC or safety car, and drivers like George Russell benefited from the incident between Gasly and Norris to finish 5th after starting 12th. Street circuits are tough when racing in Formula 1, and this track is no different. The race could have been better, but there was still a 2v2 battle at the front with the top teams. So for me, I think it joins the Emilia-Romagna race in the might watch the highlights tier. Spain. It was the Spanish Grand Prix next, and this race isn't traditionally that great considering the teams often test at the Circuit de Catalunya and have a huge amount of data. This year, the race exceeded expectations though, as the new regulations potentially allowed for more overtaking and closer racing. The race in Barcelona was hosted in some windy conditions, and as a result, there were uncharacteristic mistakes from top drivers which put them out of position. Hamilton understeered into turn 4 and collided with Kevin Magnussen, which dropped him to the back. But then in the laps that followed, both Carlos Sainz and Max Verstappen found themselves taking unexpected trips into the gravel trap at that same turn. This made it look comfortable for Charles Leclerc at the front until his power unit failure took him out of the race completely. On the whole, it was a great weekend of racing with different strategies and battles for the lead. It was perhaps the first weekend of the year where Mercedes were able to compete with the front runners, and it was a great battle to watch. It was a shame that we didn't get to see Verstappen try and hunt down Leclerc for the win in the end, and because that was missing, I'm going to put this race in the We'll Watch Again tier. Monaco next, and in hindsight, this race weekend has turned out to be more controversial than we'd all expected. As always, qualifying was critical at this track, given it's so difficult to overtake, and it was Sergio Perez that managed to qualify third on the grid behind the Ferraris as he oversteered into the barriers just before the tunnel. That crash prevented other drivers from completing their final runs and impacted the Mexican driver's teammate, Max Verstappen. Given the way the results had fallen early on, there was a lot of pressure on Verstappen's shoulders as he was in a close championship battle with Charles Leclerc. The race itself was a strategic one with a late downpour of rain, meaning the race started in the wet conditions. This was a great situation for the racing as it made the strategy even more important, and the decision of whether to go straight from wet tyres to slicks or to go with some laps on the intermediates was critical for the teams. Red Bull managed to make it work, particularly with Perez, who managed to come out ahead of Sainz, who tried the one-stop approach, and ahead of Charles Leclerc, who made his initial stop onto Inters too late. On the whole, it was a great race, particularly considering it was on the streets of Monaco, and for me, I think it goes in the We'll Watch Again tier. Azerbaijan. The Baku street circuit traditionally produces one of the most exciting races of the season, but as with any Formula 1 race, they can't be all top tier. The race in Azerbaijan was eventful for all the wrong reasons for Ferrari, as Sainz had a hydraulics issue which meant he retired early on, and then Charles Leclerc had a second engine failure in 3 races to see him drop out of the lead. What followed was a strong 1-2 finish for Red Bull, with Verstappen winning by 20 seconds and George Russell making up the final podium spot. A big difference to the unexpected podium that we saw at this track in 2021. Once again, Ferrari's poor reliability stole what could have been a very good ending to the race. So for me, I think this race goes in the bit boring tier, as I just can't bring myself to say that the Baku street circuit needs to get off the calendar. Canada. The Canadian Grand Prix returned to the calendar next, and it was a wet qualifying session that made this race interesting. Alonso managed to put his Alpine on the front row of the grid in those conditions, and the 2 Haas cars of Magnussen and Schumacher ended up 5th and 6th on the grid respectively. So we had a mixed up order, which tends to be a good indicator of a good Grand Prix. The race itself saw a couple of mechanical retirements for Perez and Schumacher, both having power unit issues, and then a late safety car triggered by a Tsunoda crash led to a 15-lap dash to the finish as Carlos Sainz chased down Max Verstappen on fresher tyres. The race itself was decided by less than a second, and for me, this is one that I would put in the Would Watch Again tier of the list. Britain. It was then the British Grand Prix, which is one of the first races of the year where Mercedes were competitive in terms of outright pace on a Sunday. The race itself started with a worrying incident which saw Zhou Guanyu thrown against the barriers after George Russell tagged the AlphaTauri of Pierre Gasly before hitting the Alfa Romeo of Zhou on the start line. But following the red flag delay, the race that unfolded was one of the best of the season. On the restart, there was a 4-car battle for the lead between the top 2 teams. Carlos Sainz took the lead and was being hunted down by Max Verstappen. With the debris left on the circuit following the first lap incidents, the Red Bull number 1 then got damage, meaning he dropped down the order. From that point, we caught a glimpse of how close this championship could have been if Max Verstappen wasn't in it, as the rest of the leaders were so closely matched. A late safety car to rescue the stranded Alpine of Esteban Ocon then created a brilliant dash to the finish, with Charles Leclerc on old tyres at the front and the others behind on fresh rubber. The wheel-to-wheel racing even included a 2-car overtake for Lewis Hamilton as he got past Leclerc and Perez into the final corner. That next lap saw a 5-car battle with 5 different teams involved in some of the best on-track action we saw all season. There's no doubt for me then that this race deserves to be in the top tier, as not only did we have that quality racing, we also had a maiden winner in Carlos Sainz. Austria. The Austrian Grand Prix was another that was full of excitement this season, and shockingly, it was Ferrari's last win of 2022. The race marked the halfway point in the year, and that weekend it seemed to all be about which car could preserve the life of the Pirelli tyres. Charles Leclerc had to fight Verstappen for position on 2 occasions though, as he extended his first stint compared to his rival, which then gave him an advantage for the rest of the race. It wasn't just great battles for the lead that made this race interesting though, as the midfield battle was great to watch as well. Just like in Silverstone, at one point 5 drivers were competing for points-paying positions, and the battle went for several corners, as the undulating nature of the Red Bull ring, combined with the new regulations, allowed cars to race closer together. It was another brilliant race, and for me, I think it joins the top tier category as well. France. The French Grand Prix was host to one of the most pivotal moments of the 2022 F1 Championship. The gap between Leclerc and Verstappen in the championship was closing after the Ferrari driver's strong victory in Austria, and Leclerc was in a good place after taking pole at Paul Ricard. But early on in the race, Leclerc made an unforced error as he put his car in the wall and was forced to retire. This race wasn't a turning point in the championship, but it all but confirmed that Verstappen would be champion this year. Verstappen himself even points to this moment as the point at which he was confident he would be the champion. The rest of the race included a few moments of action, with an opportunistic post-VSC overtake from George Russell on Sergio Perez, securing a Mercedes double podium, but for me, this race wasn't exceptional, and I think it sits in the bit boring tier. Hungary. Hungary was a race that was an eye-opener in 2022. George Russell took a shock pole position as the Mercedes looked in strong form at the Hungaroring. Meanwhile, Max Verstappen was 10th on the grid due to an error on his first Q3 run, and then had a power unit related problem which prevented him from setting a representative lap time in the second runs. I have to say that having a top driver down in 10th on the grid is an excellent way of making things interesting. The race itself saw a close battle for the lead and different strategy approaches which actually saw Ferrari drop from 2nd and 3rd on the grid to end up 4th and 6th at the checkered flag. Meanwhile, Max Verstappen made some impressive overtakes and combined that with timely pit stops to regain the lead, even completing a pirouette in the process. The race continued to have battles at the front, with the Mercedes cars challenging each other towards the end as they took the other 2 spots on the podium. The race was almost potentially even better, with the rain starting to fall right at the end, but this ended up not making a material difference for the race. Overall, the race at Hungary was another memorable one, with some awesome performances up and down the grid. So for me, I think it goes in the will watch again tier. Belgium. Belgium returned after the farcical 2021 race, and it was a definite improvement compared to a race that didn't have any racing laps. As is common at this track, 8 drivers were forced to take engine penalties, including both Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc. Verstappen started 14th on the grid and managed to go from that starting slot to the lead of the race within just 14 laps. The Red Bull was so dominant at this track, and from that point Verstappen looked comfortable out at the front. The race ended up being an easy 1-2 finish for Red Bull, as it was one of their strongest weekends of the season. They even seemed to turn the engines down to protect them towards the end. On the other hand, in another Ferrari blunder, Leclerc opted for a late pit stop to get the fastest lap. In doing so, he lost a position to Fernando Alonso, which he got back, but then failed to take the fastest lap anyway. To put the cherry on top for Leclerc, he received a 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane, which demoted him back behind the Spanish driver. On the whole, this was a race that was a bit boring, in my opinion. Netherlands. The Dutch Grand Prix next, and this race was one that was made interesting with a late safety car towards the end of the race. The race was looking comfortable for Verstappen, as he'd built a strong lead from the rest of the field before the Alfa Romeo of Valtteri Bottas pulled to a stop on the start-finish straight. This meant the cars would run behind the safety car and through the pit lane. A stop for Verstappen, but not for Hamilton, left the Mercedes driver leading towards the end, but the Red Bull driver was on fresh tyres, and he was too strong on the restart and managed to overtake Hamilton almost instantly. The Mercedes ended up down in 4th position, with Verstappen still holding on to the victory by 4 seconds from George Russell, who also went for the additional pit stop during the safety car. It was an exciting end to what was a good Grand Prix, considering the circuit is not one that overtaking tends to be easy on. So for me, I think the Dutch Grand Prix goes in the might watch the highlights tier. Italy. Monza next, and the races at this track in the last couple of years have thrown up some surprise results, but this year it wasn't so exciting. The race saw Verstappen receive another grid drop for power unit parts, but as in Belgium, it didn't take him long to take advantage of the straight line speed advantage that he had in his Red Bull this year. The Dutch driver built a strong lead before a late safety car at the end made it seem like there could have been a dramatic finish. But there wasn't time to allow the lap runners through and get the race restarted, which meant they crossed the finish line behind the safety car. To be honest, it was a disappointing end to a disappointing race, which is why it's ended up in the bit boring tier. Singapore. The Singapore Grand Prix was delayed due to some storms and rain on track, but once it got underway, it was well worth the wait. The drama started on Saturday though, which was also contested in the wet conditions, as Max Verstappen was unable to complete his last qualifying lap after he aborted one and didn't have enough fuel to get to the end. It was a dramatic ending to qualifying and left Verstappen 8th on the grid. Once the race began, Verstappen made a rare poor start as he ended up going backwards, dropping to 12th on a circuit where it's traditionally very difficult to overtake. In the race, we saw many top drivers making errors, with Lewis Hamilton heading into the barrier, and even Max Verstappen outbraking himself in an effort to overtake Lando Norris. So both championship protagonists from 2021 had a tough evening. It was Sergio Perez that took the victory, and it was a race weekend that had a lot of action, so for me I think this one goes in the We'll Watch Again tier. Japan. The Japanese Grand Prix saw the crowning of Max Verstappen's second World Championship. He was very comfortable out at the front in this race despite the changeable conditions. This race was red flagged early on, and that actually triggered one of the worst decisions of the year as the FIA allowed a tractor onto the circuit when the cars were behind the safety car. At the time, Pierre Gasly was behind the group and was, as he is expected, catching up to the main train. That meant that the AlphaTauri driver was completely unsighted as he approached the tractor, which didn't have any visible lights. A dreadful FIA decision. The rest of the race remained full of controversy, with a shortened race distance after the 3-hour limit was reached. It was confusing as to how many points would be given out, and a loophole in the regulations that has existed for many years was exposed by this decision. The Belgian Grand Prix from last year resulted in significant changes, but with half of the race completed, the Japanese Grand Prix still offered full points. The downside of this is of course the fact that the winning moment was taken away from Verstappen, although a 5-second post-race penalty for Leclerc was needed as well. But regardless, there would have been at least a moment for Verstappen to celebrate, rather than the teams rooting through the sporting regulations after the checkered flag. On the whole, it was a race of what could have been. It would have been awesome to see it play out for the full distance, so for me, it goes in the bit boring tier as I just think it had so much more to offer. USA. The US Grand Prix was next, and this circuit is one that tends to produce good racing. The circuit is high on tyre degradation, and this race was no different. There were many incidents through this race which advantaged some teams and drivers when they came at the right time. At the second set of stops, Verstappen had a slow trip into the pits as he ended up further down the order. Once again though, it took Verstappen to have some issue or a grid drop to make any races interesting. We also had Sebastian Vettel lead a few laps for the last time in his career, which was a great highlight. And in the end, it all boiled down to a race to the finish between Verstappen and Hamilton. It was a good battle, but ultimately the pace of the Red Bull was too strong once again. For me, this race goes in the Might Watch the Highlights tier. Mexico. Mexico is next, and to be honest, this circuit is always one that has an awesome atmosphere but often fails to deliver when it comes to exciting racing. The high altitude nature of this track means that the teams run high downforce setups, and they often struggle to race closer together. This year was no different, with some teams trying to make the medium tyres run to the end, with the others going for the hard compound instead. The tyre degradation in the end wasn't high enough to make that strategy particularly interesting, and so it was a shame that there wasn't a softer set of compounds brought to this Grand Prix. The other fascinating element of this race was the fact that the Ferrari team had to turn down their power units so much just to keep them cool. It resulted in a noticeable drop in form, and with the reliability elements that the teams are able to use to improve their engines in the next few years, I think this is something that Ferrari will need to focus on going into next year. Overall, for me, this race goes in the get off the calendar tier. I think it's a brilliant event and atmosphere, but the racing isn't up to scratch at the moment. Sao Paulo. The race in Brazil this year was a great weekend of action. The Sao Paulo circuit hosted the final sprint of 2022, and it created some of the best action as well. Like in Imola, the Friday qualifying was hosted in changeable conditions, which allowed for a mixed-up grid and created a brilliant sprint race event, which saw the Mercedes of George Russell overtake Max Verstappen for the win. Meanwhile, the pole sitter Kevin Magnussen managed to hold on to a single point with 8th. The race on Sunday was one of the best, with a lap 1 incident between Magnussen and Ricciardo and different race strategies up and down the order, with different tyre choices throughout the sprint and the main race. We then had battles at the sharp end of the grid, with contact between Hamilton and Verstappen in a move that was reminiscent of the 2021 championship fight. Lewis Hamilton fought his way back up the order to second position, with Sainz rounding out the podium. But But on the top step, it was George Russell who became the second maiden winner of 2022. And funnily enough, this race joined Silverstone in the top tier category. Even after the race, there was drama after Verstappen opted not to pass the position back to Sergio Perez, and it opened up the controversy from all the way back in Monaco. The track in Sao Paulo is one of the best, and I hope it becomes the last race of the season at some point again in the future. Abu Dhabi. The Abu Dhabi Grand Prix was one that actually surprised me. Last year we saw the changes to the circuit which we didn't really see the impact of, or certainly I didn't, given all the other tension and drama surrounding that race. This year though, I think we saw these changes come into their own. Yes, many of the overtakes were dependent on the long DRS enabled back straight, but the following complex of corners also helped the racing as well. It was a shame then that the battles themselves weren't for the lead but for second place, as Leclerc and Perez battled for second in the championship while Verstappen coasted to the final victory of the year. The battle for second was a strategic one, with the difference between the one-stop and the two-stop strategy being minimal, and the rest of the midfield had some close battles as well. So for that reason, I think this race goes into the Might Watch the Highlights category. So there we have it, my 2022 race tier list. On the whole, the races this season were good, but the dominance of a single driver and single team meant the season could have been better. Hopefully there are more teams at the front going into 2023. Let me know which races I've put in the wrong place, and make sure to subscribe for more post-season content.